Hi, everybody. We are looking at the Realism Packet. So just leave this video running in another browser window, but hop back over there to the Realism Packet because I'm going to be walking through it and you'll have both the words and me explaining it to help you figure this all out. All right. So we are going to start Realism Packet. Um, Realism is a really important type of theater that we kind of base most of our play acting on these days. There are certainly plays that have gone on to do more experimental things, but realism is the basis of most actor training now. It is the basis of most acting in movies. Um, and essentially, it's just acting that wants to convince the audience that what you're doing is really happening, that you're really feeling those things and really doing those things, even though in truth, you're just acting like it. So let's start with the definitions. Realism is theater that strives to represent things as they truly are. So instead of just having crazy cardboard sets or big paintings behind them, they put the actual furniture out. They have the actual things that would go in a kitchen. If they're pretending that they're cooking, they might actually have a working stove so that they can make eggs while they're on stage. We want for the audience to believe that everything happening is real and we're just looking at it and watching it as it unfolds. This is the big note though, because this is a big confusion that a lot of people have. Realism does not mean the stories really happened. I'm going to say that again for the people in the back. Realism does not mean that the stories really happened. It means it's a made up story, but you want for the audience to think it's real. So your costumes, your set, your lights, everything is realistic, but it's not necessarily true. There is one play that we're going to study, which is A Doll's House, which takes place in what's called naturalism. And naturalism is an offshoot of realism, but it actually is very, very based in science and very based in this is the environment that they live in. And there's no and because of fate or because of God. It's like, no, we are getting rid of any outside influences. We are just doing what happens because of human nature in this time. For example, A Doll's House is all about this woman facing the oppression of women in 1879 Norway. That whole story happens because of 1879 Norway. If it wasn't taking place at that time, the play doesn't really make sense because it's based in the nature of that time. All right, the last thing is we're studying a play called 12 Angry Men, which takes place in what's called real time. Real time means that the show never stops. It doesn't take a break and go oh, next scene, 2 days later, because it can still be realistic that way, but we just missed 2 days of the story. Realism says this play is going to last an hour and 45 minutes. It is never going to stop, and you are going to start, see what happens in the middle, and end in an hour 45 minutes because you are watching an hour and 45 minutes of real life, real time. If a show ever stops and then takes place later in the day or next week, it is not real time. All right, so before we get into what realism actually is, we need to understand what was happening before, and that was called oratory theater. This is what was happening all across Europe for most of the 17 and 1800s. They would overplay their scenes. It was all about being over the top. It was all about speaking as clearly and beautifully as you can. They didn't have microphones, so it was this talent to have a voice that could go into a theater and mesmerize people throughout the theater based on how beautifully you speak. And even though they were still performing like a Shakespeare play, it was so valued of how well they could speak and pretend like they were having these emotions that they might reach the end of a speech and just stop and take a bow. Therefore, no one believes the story's really happening, but they're impressed by this person's skill. So it was based in look how good I am at this, not in look at what this character's feeling. And so it lacked a sense of truth. It lacked um, believability. It was impressive, but the costumes were crazy over the top. You see the picture there of the lady in like her big wig and her fan and all of that. It's not a very believable type of theater. And there were two people, if you scroll down now and look at Moscow Art Theater, there were two people who really hated oratory theater and said, if you're doing that, if you're just overplaying everything, if you're not connecting to it, then the audience doesn't have to think. They're just being entertained. But we want to tell stories that are meaningful and important. So in 1898, a new theater was founded. Um, and while it was started by Constantin Stanislavski, which is the second guy down there, with another playwright who isn't very important and he has the most Russian name ever. But immediately he actually started partnering with Anton Chekhov. Anton Chekhov was a Russian playwright who was really based in realism. It was something no one else was really doing, especially in Russia. Um, so he was starting to write these plays, and the first one was called The Seagull. And The Seagull had a lot of support and eventually became a big hit, but it also had a lot of people that were against it because in oratory theater, a woman could be dressed like the woman in the picture and just be playing the maid. But Anton Chekhov said, no, if someone's playing a maid, she needs to talk like a maid. She needs to dress like a maid. She shouldn't be in tons of makeup. She's a maid. And there were people that protested against that. They were like, if I wanted to see a maid, I'd go home and look at my maid. I want to see something beautiful. But Anton Chekhov said, no, these stories can be beautiful, but they're beautiful because they seem real. So he wrote The Seagull and then went on and wrote a few more. You can see he died at the age of 44, so he didn't live long enough to create a huge body of work. But what he was doing was writing these plays where he was trying to convince the audience that the government should become communist. Um, there, Karl Marx had written the Communist Manifesto, which is the book that it's based on, before that, and he thought it was great. He was like, why do we have a few incredibly rich people and a bunch of suffering poor people when we could use communism, which would pool all that money together and give everyone a living wage? Of course, communism ended up not working in Russia because while it's a really good idea, it's also very corruptible and it gives the government way too much power. And so it ended up not working. But he didn't know that. So he was writing plays to get people to buy into the idea of income equality and communism. And he met Constantin Stanislavski. Constantin Stanislavski loved his plays and produced all of them. He founded the Moscow Art Theatre in 1898, and he brought to it. He was an actor, but he was also a director. But he didn't want any of those actors that were doing oratory theater and stopping in the middle of a play to take a bow. He wanted for his actors to use what was called method acting, which he created. So um, he would teach his actors in a class for like a year or so that they would learn how to do method acting before he would ever cast them. He was a great teacher, and many of the great teachers throughout history who created other acting tools actually studied with him first. You may have heard of the Stella Adler School in New York. She trained with Constantin Stanislavski. So he was this great teacher that would teach them how to do method acting and then would stage plays using it. And while at first there were some rebellions against it, it became the most important partnership for modern American and European theater. Um, because they created this world of realism that most plays, movies, and television series are still based in today. Um, so let's talk about method acting for just a minute. It's also called the method. Stanislavski said all these people in oratory theater are just standing there and speaking beautifully, right? They're just coming out and they're going, to be or not to be. That is the question. And he's like, but in that moment, Hamlet is contemplating suicide. And when you come out and you just speak beautifully and boom throughout the room, I don't believe you're actually contemplating committing suicide. And he's like, so you need to connect to the character and figure out what they're actually feeling and what they actually need in this scene. So he said to truly play a character, you need to know three things. What is their objective? Meaning, what do they want for the other character to do? And what tactics are they using to get that objective? And most people think of tactics in terms of ing words, demanding, asking, um, begging, manipulating. What tactics are they using to get that objective? And finally, obstacles. What is standing in the way of the character getting that objective? Because no one wants to watch a play where a bunch of people are just getting everything they want. They have to have something to overcome in order for it to be a good story. So that's your obstacle. So let's look at an example of that. If a character really likes another character and wants for him to ask her out, it would break down like this for the female character. Objective. I want for him to ask me out. Tactic. I am flirting so that he sees I'm interested. Obstacle. He really likes my sister and doesn't want to date me. So what I want is to be asked out. What I'm doing is flirting, and what I'm trying to overcome is to get him to like me instead of my sister. All right. The other part of method acting is the use of what's called sense memory. So what he's saying is, if you're doing To Be or Not to Be by Hamlet, in order to understand it, you need to say, what is he feeling? He's feeling completely defeated. He's feeling like the world is hopeless and he kind of just wants to get out of it. So what he's doing is, or what you should be doing as an actor, is think of a time when you felt completely hopeless. When you felt that there wasn't really much point in trying to do something anymore because you were just overwhelmed. And when you think of that time and you kind of get back into that feeling, now present the speech. Use that memory of what your senses were, sense memory, to help you recreate that feeling so you can play it when you're saying Hamlet's words. So that objective, tactic, obstacle, and sense memory all help you create a character that you're connected to, is realistic and believable. So there you have the summary. Um, and yeah, I just put in there. It's hard to imagine it, but there were hundreds and hundreds of years that people didn't want for the audience to believe that what they were doing was true. They were entertaining them. They weren't trying to make you get lost into it. They didn't want you to believe they were the character. They were just playing a character. So what Stanislavski and Chekhov did was create a situation where people could believe it. And when they believed it, it would let them think about it more. And it would be able to say things that mattered. So by doing that and using method acting, they were able to put together something that made theater more relevant for what's now been 120 years. All right, now that you've done that, you should look at the 4 play of the day videos, and then you'll be ready to do your realism quiz. All right, thank you. Stay healthy and safe.